Chapter 5. She was not fond of animals, had had a puppy once, and been much moved when it was run over, but had not missed him, had been annoyed by kittens, but rather pleased by calves on a farm she visited once. That was her history, a dubious beginning for a bear. So she thought, maybe I'll start on the books first, work from the known to the unknown, but she had also to go out to the outhouse, which was in the same direction as his shed. She plucked up her courage. If she could not face the animal, she might take some interest in the chinking and notching of his shelter. From the front, the house looked single and solitary, but there was a fungus of outbuildings behind it, a board and batten woodshed and a tumble-down log house connected to it by something that looked like a corn crib, and was perhaps a wood shelter of the remains of a chicken house. Together they formed a fenced compound. She approached this compound by its southward gate. The bear would be in the old cabin. There was a post by the door, and on the post a chain which disappeared into darkness. The ground was muddy, but there was no new tracks in the mud. "What do you say to a bear?" she wondered, leaning on the fence. "Hello," she said softly into the darkness. She got no reply. It must be asleep, she thought. Maybe it's still hibernating. The time she had met a moose was the only time she had felt her knees knocking. She expected to be afraid of the bear, but here she was standing quite calmly in his doorway. She was certain that it was there, and that it was benevolent. She wondered what kind of fool she was. She went back into the house, slamming the screen door behind her. There was a great deal to do before she could do what she wanted, start on the books, because if she did not unpack now, she would live her life here in a muddle. First she organized her personal possessions in the bedroom. Then she loaded the canned goods haphazardly into the kitchen cupboards. It took her a long time to decide what to do with refrigerator things like butter and bacon. She found a rusty four-sided toaster and put it over the gas element. She wiped a black iron frying pan out and laid strips of bacon in it. She was hungry. The morning light was dappled, fallow, green, a moving presence at the windows. The kitchen swam in an underwater gloom. When her breakfast was cooked, she carried it out to the stoop of the woodshed to sit in the light. As she sat down, she realized the bear was standing in the doorway, staring at her. Bear. There. Staring. She stared back. Everyone has once in his life to decide whether he is a platonist or not, she thought. I'm a woman sitting on a stoop eating bread and bacon. That is a bear. Not a toy bear. Not a Pooh bear. Not an airlines koala bear. A real bear. Half a bear, actually, and not a very big half, for it lay tentatively in his doorway so that she had no idea of its size. It was only a dusky bulk of blackish fur in a doorway. It had a long brown snout, and its snout had a black, dry, leathery end. It had small, sad eyes. They stared at each other as she ate, sizing each other up. It was no less small-eyed when it turned full face towards her. Its gaze was not direct. It was diffused by the angles of its skull. This long brown snout and these small eyes turned towards her. It did not seem menacing, only tired and sad. The only sign of animation was a quivering of the nostrils at the sound of her fork on the enamel plate. She thought, you have these ideas about bears. They are toys, or something fierce and ogreish in the woods, following you at a distance, snuffling you out to snuff you out. But this bear is a lump. Then, because the one thing she knew about animals was their enormous and, it seemed to her, parasitical hunger, she went into the shed and scooped dry food from a sack into the basin that sat beside it. This she took gingerly to the bear. It looked perhaps a little brighter as it quickly curved an arm out and pulled the basin to it and put its jaws inside. Then it looked up to her again, as if for permission. No, she thought, more likely it wants me to go away. She watched it from a distance while it gorged noisily. When it had finished, it looked up at her and licked its nose with a long, thin, anteater's tongue. Then it licked its chops with a tongue that seemed to have become short and fat. Then, with what seemed a very great effort, it hauled itself on all fours and advanced towards her. She sucked in her breath and stood quite still, forbidding her knees to knock a second time. The bear stood in the open, on all fours, and stared at her, moving its head up, down, and sideways to get a full view of her. Its nose was more pointed than she had expected. Years of corruption by teddy bears, she supposed. And its eyes were genuinely piggish and ugly. She crossed the yard and pumped it a pail of water. She sat the pail down, quite near it, nearer than she thought she ought to have dared, but the bear looked so passive she could genuinely not fear it. In its stable doorway it had looked smaller. Now she could see that it was what Homer would call a good size. Up to her hip, and long with it, a full-grown bear with a scruff like a widow's hump. As it turned to drink, she got a large whiff of shit and musk. It was indubitably male, she saw, and its hindquarters were matted with dirt. After it drank thirstily, it curled up again by the barn door. It looked stupid and defeated. She hunkered down where it could not reach her and stared at it. Its nose was like a dog's but broader. Its snout was narrow. Its eyes were close together. It was not a handsome beast, and it would not be, if it was always lived at the end of that chain. She thought briskly of restoring some gloss to it, taking it for walks. "Bear," she whispered to it, "who and what are you?" Bear did not reply, but turned its head towards her with a look of infinite weariness, and closed its eyes. She sat for a long time smoking, drinking coffee, staring at it. She had taken some nephews to a bad movie about bears once. That was all. An unprepossessing creature, this bear, she decided. Not at all menacing, not a creature of the wild, but a middle-aged woman defeated to the point of being daft, who had sat night after night waiting for her husband so long that time had ceased to exist and there was only waiting. I can manage him, she decided, and went inside. She washed her dishes, spent some time rearranging the kitchen cupboards to suit her left-handedness, exclaiming to herself over the kitchen dishes, which should not in such a place have been anything other than willow pattern, and were not, and, knowing further delay was only delicious procrastination, moved slowly through the arc of the house, parlor to hall, and stood at the foot of the stairs. A house like this, she thought, in these regions was an absurdity, too elaborate, too hard to heat, no matter how much its fair and logical designer thought it good for the brain. To build such a place in the north among log houses and sturdy square farmhouses was colonial pretentiousness. She shivered as she thought of the open stairwell in the howling winter. When he sold these plans, Fowler had recommended a construction of a homemade stucco that turned out to be as durable as flypaper. He was the sort of American we are all warned about. She went up towards the light, complaining in her practical mind about immigrant idiocies, stopped dead at the top of the stairs in a blaze of sunshine. The two chimneys hemmed the stairwell. Over it gleamed an enormous windowed lantern. Aside from that, the second floor was open. 4 walls were windowed to the height of built-in counters. The other 4 were papered with glass bookshelves. There were vast sofas in front of the fireplaces and low tables stacked with folio-sized books. An elaborate bass Tilly lamp hung over the counter, facing the river. The windows were shaded with nautical-looking rolled-up canvas blinds. From the front window the river had another dimension. She could see it idling all the way to the river channel. She stood quietly, fingering the brass and leather telescope on the sill, dusting with empty fingers the celestial and terrestrial globes on either side of it. If the books were all bad Boston Bunions, she did not want to know yet. She went to the table by the northern fireplace and opened a volume of engravings of ruins, Piranesi. She stared at the broken columns for a long time. Then she went and looked out the back window, brushing a dead fly off the empty counter. The bear was staring up at her. She waded around the room slowly, reverently. It was a sea of gold and green light. She wondered where to begin, and indulged herself by lazily scanning the shelves, trying to comprehend the book's scope and order. She was presented with a sharp and perhaps typical early 19th century mind: encyclopedias, British and Greek history, Voltaire, Rousseau, geology and geography, geophysical speculation, and more practical philosophers, sets and sets of novelists. She wondered where else there was such a perfect library for its period. She had no fear that her work would not consume a summer. She went downstairs and brought up her paper, her typewriter, her filing cards. She sat down immediately and tapped out a letter to the director, telling him that all was well. She looked up at her watch and discovered it was time to leave for Homer's store. End of chapter 5. Okay, chapter 6. She was still trying to find the snap of the elbow that would whip the motor to life when Homer veered around the point and drew up beside her. She looked at him in daylight. He had a shrewd face, round, pink-framed plastic glasses, very false teeth, little broken veins on his cheeks. He wore a green drill workman's cap and a red mackinaw. She liked him. After he showed her again the knack of getting the engine going, she followed him down the channel. He yelled back to her that the water was low this year, and told her the names of the shoals and asked did she know the difference between a shoal and an island. It had to have a tree to be an island. That was important up here. That island there was where Mrs. Bird was found almost dead one spring among her 11 children. Her husband had gone out across the ice for supplies in January, must have fallen through. She and the children survived the winter on turnips. They were okay, but she was in hospital so long the Children's Aid had to farm out all the kids, and only one ever came back to see her, though she lived to be 94. People still do get lost, he said, winters when the ice is punky. Homer's grocery store left a sophisticated taste, something to desire, but contained the necessities. It made her glad she had grown up on Campbell's soup and bologna and peanut butter sandwiches. He sold withered potatoes, knobby carrots, and wilted cabbages, but good local cheese and pale, creamy butter. He apologized for the vegetables. I have to get the stuff up from Toronto, and it don't keep. You'll have to eat turnips and cabbages like the rest of us. She treated herself to a quart of maple syrup and arranged for him to pick up her mail in the nearest town. He waited on her himself. No one else came in. She was aware of doors banging and voices calling in the back of the building, but there was no sign of his wife or his family. "How's the bear?" he asked. "Oh, fine, I guess," she said, not knowing what else to say. "It looks pretty miserable tied up that way." "Don't forget, however human it looks, it's a wild critter after all. Don't get soft with it." "Did they take it for walks?" "I don't know what the hell they did with it, pardon my French." "It could use a swim." "I wouldn't fool around with it. You might have to get to know it the hard way. I guess it looks kind of little when it's all curled up in the shed, but a bear's a heavy animal. It can knock your head off with a wallop. I bet it weighs 600 pounds. "Didn't Mrs. Leroy ever take it out?" He grinned. "Oh, she was a funny one. I've seen her with that bear. She used to take one of them straight kitchen chairs out to the backyard and sit and just talk to it for hours. Maybe French talk, maybe Cree. I couldn't make it out. She's a wonderful knitter, Mrs. Leroy, and on a fine day she'll sit there and talk and knit a mile a minute. The two of them together, they were a sight to see." His eyes got shifty again. There was something he had thought of, but didn't want to say. "It's vicious, isn't it?" "That bear? Jeepers, no. It's just, well, he's just a plain old bear. And he's been on that chain for so many years there's no one telling what would happen if you let him loose. He might kill you. He might just sit there. He might walk across the yard and take a leak. Mrs. Leroy wouldn't think very much of you if you let it get away, though, and neither would the farmers further back along the shore." She promised she would not, and drove the motor boat home alone, back along the creeping river. The water was dark, yet clear and metallic-looking, too cold to trail a hand in. She steered between shoals and islands and reedy shores to her dock, and carried her groceries into the isolated house. That evening she went upstairs with a rag and polished glass inkwells and pen racks and the yellowed globes. She fussed with the telescope until she could see far down the empty river in the last of the light. Then she lit the Tilly lamp, put a roll of labels in her typewriter, and began the imperious business of imposing numerical order on a structure devised internally and personally by a mind her numbers would teach her to discover. At first she worked quickly, almost desperately. She had a presentiment of an unknown joy awaiting her, a feeling that it could easily be taken away. She must be virtuous and efficient. It was like the smell that scented the air morning and evening, elusive and mysterious. Everyone wants to be Robinson Crusoe, and be a half-hatched Robinson Crusoe is almost unbearable. If the experience is not to be taken away, I must begin on it at once, she thought. After an hour, she was shivering. She went downstairs, put on a pullover, put the kettle on. On her way out to the outdoor toilet, she could see the bear's night-green eyes following her. As she went through the yard to the back door, he just got up and grunted. She stood quite still, letting her eyes adjust to the dark so she could see his dark form. He lumbered gently forward, his head lower than his scruff, looking bashfully at her. When he reached the end of his chain, he sat down on his hams and grunted like a pig. Picking her way over the dark, rough boards of the woodshed, she went in and got him the scraps from her supper. He lapped them up at once, then looked at her, it seemed, beseechingly. She stood as far back from him as she could and held out a stiffened hand. He licked it with a long, rigid, curling tongue, but when she tried to pat his head, he swung it sideways and away from her. Upstairs again, she cruised the bookshelf in the dim light, lovingly turning their square brass keys, gently easing out a volume here, a volume there. The collection was very fine, though it pointed to no scholarly proclivities, and it had been maintained by Carey's descendants, so that it covered the 19th century in 3 languages: Hume and Smollett, Byron, of course, and other romantics: Sheridan, Dickens, Thackeray, Eliot, Notre Lope, Mrs. Gaskell, Bulwer Lytton, Darwin, but not a first edition, Jane Austen, of course, de Mausapant, Lamartine, Goethe, Schiller, a lot more German, though she did not read German. Those credits to womankind, Mrs. Herman, The Boy Stood on the Burning Deck, and Eliza Cook. I love it. I love it, and who shall dare to chide me for loving that old armchair? Young's night thoughts. Oh, everything. She arrived in her trade because she loved reading. It struck her as she peered into the great bookcase how little reading she did know. Mostly she dealt with undecipherable papers and overwritten maps. As far as books went, she was concerned with their externals only. Here she would have time to read. She found one volume of the Penny Cyclopedia, produced by the Society for the Promotion of Useful Knowledge, under the chairmanship of Lord Brougham, lying on its side. She picked it up, and a slip of paper floated to her feet. In the Linnean system, brown, beautifully curved, minute handwriting told her, Ursus comes from between Mustela and Daedaphalus. The order includes Arctos, the true bears; Meles, the badgers; Lotor, the raccoon; Lucius, the wolverine; walk, plantigrade, grinders; tuberculated; stature, large, carnivorous, frugivorous; tail, generally short; brain and nervous system fairly developed; claws for digging, non-retractable; senses acute; cylindrical bones more similar to man's than those of other quadrupeds, especially the femur; therefore able to rear up and dance; tongue has a longitudinal groove; kidneys lobed as in bunches of grapes; no seminal vesicles; bone in penis; in the female, the vagina is longitudinally ridged; clitoris resides in a deep cavity. Sparks showered from the cedar logs. She checked the handwriting against the samples in her files. It was indisputably Carey's. When the lamp began to fail, she went to bed and dreamt of what she had read on the other side of the paper. Saw the Kamchatkans on their high peninsula looking at her through the windows, and snow baths they make from the gut of the bear, and heard the whistle of mown grass falling where they slashed it with the sharpened shoulder blade of the bear. End of chapter 6. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh gosh.
Uh,
Really
it's
get